program might contain strong language. If you think you may be offended, switch off now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Watch Mojo and another episode of the Inside Podcast. I'm your host Rob, and with me is Watch Mojo CEO and co-founder Ashkan Frushan. How's it going today, Ash?
Very good. Nice cold Montreal winter day, but things are really, really good. Heating up.
Cold and snowy day as Christmas approaches, but you're right, things are heating up. So let's talk about a little update spinning off of last week's episode and your quest to bring back the Montreal Expos.
Well, to cut to the chase, I think in 2025, when you look at sports teams ownership, it's not really sadly about fans or emotion. It's really just a finance equation. You've seen the days of one wealthy owner spending tens of millions, even $100 million to buy a team. Those days are gone. Sports franchises, that asset class has risen 13% per year in value going back 60 years. So in 2025, you're talking billions of dollars. And that's really an era of private equity funds. And then just understanding the parameters and the constraints. So just as an example, using MLB, they say, okay, we're open to PE, but we're kind of sensitive to their, the rights they seek, the vetoes they seek, their time horizon. So let's cap it at 30% as an asset class and 15 per. At that point, to somebody like me who's good at matchmaking, sequencing, packaging, then you're like, okay, let's just fill the puzzle. Fan interest is there. The business of baseball has changed in the era of streaming, etc. So, it's like if, God forbid, there was like a storm of biblical proportions in Montreal and everything was ruined, I'm sure engineers would put up their hands and firemen would come to clean the mess, and I would do whatever it takes. It just so happens, I'm like one of the guys, but just who happened to be really good at finance and built a media company and who's a big baseball fan and who's in Montreal, which is ultimately, I get it. If you're MLB, you don't want some owner in absentia. You don't want some fund manager who's looking at IRR. You want somebody who could, be the pro that MLB wants, be the passionate fan that the city wants. And then on top of this, now I've rolled up this whole, and then we'll switch gears, talk about today's topic. But I've also even envisioned this whole big civic development plan. I call it 4C, which is a creative, cultural, commercial campus that would house the stadium. And it represents the biggest civic development since Expo 67, And I understand that to some people, nobody really saw or witnessed how I had to build Watch Mojo early on, which was a challenge that was gargantuan and much bigger than following a process, respecting the timeline, and just doing what MLB asks people to do when they're interested. But I always remind my citizens in this town that, if you think of how John Molson, Sam Bronfman, Pierre Pelado, how those guys built their companies 2-3 generations ago, you're seeing it, and so I'm very different than I think a PE guy or some third generation custodian, and so we operate between the improbable and the impossible. But as I look at it in a very unemotional way, I'm not a religious guy, but I feel like this is the gig that I've been prepped all my life. And it would be a big hypocrite if I'm like, hey, I see how much happiness this brings to the people and how much this could help the city. But I'm just going to sit here and, count my nickels and drink my brandy and talk to you about stuff. Anyway, but we'll come back to that when we talk about David Ellison and what drives him. And despite being the son of Larry Ellison, it's commendable. People criticize these so-called, it's somebody else said this, Barry Switzer, these sons born on third base characters. But whenever I see somebody who really doesn't need to work that hard, it's commendable. Anyway, so that's a good segue to.
Exactly. You have a lot of people excited, and so we'll be watching closely what happens. But we're shifting gears to the topic of today's episode, which is another major investment, the sale of Warner Brothers to Netflix, and then Paramount entered the chat, and so we have this kind of trifecta going on. And I want to start by addressing one of the first comments that I see here from a viewer. Camden McBride says, Netflix buying Warner Bros. Should be a really good thing. People are literally overreacting about this. Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, first of all, just if we're going to talk, let's get the right jargon. It's not actually an investment at this point. It's a full acquisition, right? So it's an acquisition that I would say at a high level explains and addresses, you could call it like the mistake that like big media did with the internet and Google, the search ecosystem, which changed discovery and recovery, but also then YouTube, right? I mean, you see YouTube and Netflix, we've talked about it. One is evolutionary, Netflix, same kind of programming as TV and theatrical, but in a different user experience. And YouTube, which is just revolutionary in that it has changed the definition of quality. What is it? Celebrity, everything. But so these two behemoths, one in AVOD, ad-supported video on demand, and one in SVOD, subscription video on demand, they've kind of just sucked out the energy from the room. And as much as traditional media still have a lot of IP, a lot of rights, a lot of legacy assets, and they've tried to evolve to also go direct to consumer. Disney did it with Disney Plus. The writing is on the wall. Audiences have shifted to the web. They consume short form video. When we started, our videos were a bit longer than the norm. And, as I say, even disruptors get disrupted. But I think it's largely to say, okay, given what we see happening with Google, YouTube's dominance, and Netflix itself worrying about YouTube's growth, then big media, it's a game of musical chairs, right? And the music will stop. And yeah, what happened was Netflix made a very, very compelling offer for, we'll just say 80% of the assets, the ones that they care about. And Warner Brothers Discovery, which was kind of Time Warner's own history. It started off after a century. It merged with AOL, one of the most disastrous M&A deals of all time. And then it was spun off, burdened with a lot of debt. And then David Zaslav, a very shrewd deal maker, merged his Discovery with Warner. But in the end, it still had to find an outcome and a home, and Netflix to merge. But you have this very, very ambitious young man in David Ellison, son of Larry, founder of Oral, one of the wealthiest people in the planet. Oracle. What did I say? Not Oracle. Okay. And so, he has access to capital. He's very ambitious, and he's kind of re-engaging them, saying, wait a minute, our offer was better for shareholders. So why are you taking Netflix's deal? And Netflix is like very confident that deal will prevail. Mm-hmm. So a little bit of late innings drama and intrigue, which I love, because in another life I would have been an M&A banker.
Yeah, well, we got another question from the audience. Mandatory critical of WatchMojo question. Who cares what WatchMojo's opinion is on this topic? From Multiverse.
Great. Yvonne, bring up the image. So, I mean, look, Michael Milken, one of the most successful investors, he had a brush with the law. He had cancer. He re-engaged. Leave this up for a while. He re-engaged and re-emerged as a philanthropist. He has one of the greatest quotes of all time. The most successful investor is a social scientist. I grew up loving humanities, went into business, was a storyteller, landed in this universe. I started WatchMojo because I understood where the puck was going in terms of trends. When we started Multiverse HQ, so I saw this pyramid, so to speak. I saw that you had, if the top represents super premium, I saw that those guys, the Foxes, the ABCs, the NBCs, would not really embrace the web because of the lack of economic determinism, to quote our friends Marx from the previous show we did on capitalism and socialism and communism. And then at the bottom, you had this revolution where, because of things like mobile phones, editing tools and all that, you had this explosion of user-generated content, to the point that in 2006, Time Magazine's Person of the Year was you, Y-O-U, because of UGC. So WatchMojo was a pioneer, recognizing that there was an opportunity and a vacuum in that middle, and we kind of reinvented what programming looked like. Our music videos looked like VH1. Our sports videos looked like something that ESPN could produce. Our history videos looked like something out of the History Channel or CNN. And we did that for 20 years, and the market shifted to the point where big media got the memo a bit late. And I'm not blaming them. They had no economic incentive to do that. So what you ended up seeing was that pyramid was no longer the case. Like, that pyramid made no sense if you said, well, Disney blew up its business precipitated by COVID, but they blew up their business justement to embrace consumers and go direct to consumer. So what ended up happening is you had companies that had a lot of content invest in distribution, either by acquiring or by launching their own platforms. And then you also had these distribution platforms, these big tech platforms that were now like in this brave new world, the masters of the universe. There's a saying, Hollywood thinks it rules the planet, Silicon Valley thinks it rules the universe. So you had a company like Apple licensing content, you had Google acquiring YouTube, but still being a neutral platform. And you had others that were like, we're just going to get into content production ourselves. So these two spheres started to merge. And you could argue now that this is where we are, that there's no real difference. There is, but there's not as much of a difference anymore between Paramount, Skydance, or formerly Paramount known as Viacom, and a Google or YouTube, because they're all fighting for attention, watch time, mind share, market share, market dominance. So the reason why you care about WatchMojo or not is, for one, we cover trends, we cover the zeitgeist. We also have been telling you where the puck is going, whether it's in the new movies you like, or whether it's tapping into your nostalgia to say, if you like X, you may like this new thing Y. But the people that care about what we say is because they want to know where the world is going. Now, you don't have to listen. You could put your, I'm not being rude and say, put your head in the sand. You could go watch one of the other 10 videos we did on Batman and, whatever. But some people do care about this. And those people are the ones that make these decisions. They're the ones that read what entrepreneurs are doing and what operators are doing. And then they have access to capital and their thesis. So, if you're happy with life, keep doing what you're doing. If you want to know where the puck is going, just open your blinds a bit. That's it. It's a free world. This ain't North Korea.
In your view, who are the biggest winners and losers in this change of structure that's occurred?
I mean, the reality is, I hate to say it, losers do historically tend actually to be the stakeholder known as employees, because you don't need two groups of lawyers. You don't need two groups of marketing. But that's also just the cycle of life and business. I think that's just why you have to adapt and change. I think consumers could go either way. If you had again, I don't criticize people, but just objectively. So the Arrow and Viacom, the Redstone family, gave the keys to Phil Dahlman, who was a lawyer. Well, you kind of anticipated that they were going to take a more bottom line approach. So big movies were not as flashy, and it was more of a cost cutting, bottom line oriented strategy. David Ellison is not that. I mean, his critics could say, oh, he took daddy's money to produce movies, he even acted in some, but I just see passion, so which is what you want. It starts with passion and ambition. So I think if David Ellison were to prevail somehow, that could be interesting, because otherwise media companies do tend to produce less over time. There's always booms and busts, but the long-term trends are that these big companies that, like a tree, have grown fatter and fatter with the rings around the wood. These generally are in shrinking mode. We live in a world where there's an advertising tax that everybody has to pay to Google. There's a commerce tax everybody has to pay to Amazon. So I think if you are a stakeholder that is part of Paramount, Skydance, or Warner Brothers Discovery, that Google's not really going to buy you. So if you have a Netflix, ultimately a platform, but still more traditional than just Google, and now you got Skydance. I mean, that to me, I think the net will be positive. I understand. And yesterday in our editorial meeting, I asked the team, just as consumers, I said, how do you feel about this? It was pretty clear. Most were very skeptical. But I feel that somebody like David Ellison is probably more of a net positive for creativity, let's say. Yeah. But it's also not just, ironically, the 20 years ago YouTube and 25 years ago Google was misplayed. Today, we're now in the era of AI. So my arithmetic says Netflix wanted to buy the rich catalog that Warner Brothers brings to give them something that, sure, even if AI can create new derivative or transformative, and that's a key distinction in copyright, but let's just set that aside today. But I feel they go, even if, okay, if we own this IP, there's still AI that's an uncertainty. They're effectively bulletproofing themselves from an era where people will, I mean, it's going to happen. It's even happening already, where AI will create stories. And, yes, that's good for Netflix if they have the audience and the resources. But that also means that people could disrupt Netflix. The next Squid Games, the next Stranger Things will probably not come out of Netflix. So ultimately, I think it's both like a very secular industry level game of checkers, but it's actually more of a strategic, overarching game of chess, where they're like, hey, AI is going to rewrite everything. We need to get bigger and better, especially since big tech is only going to get stronger. None of these big tech companies are going to get weaker. It is a bit of a zero sum, but by and large, the cohort known as big tech platforms, they're going to get stronger.
We probably should have started with this, but just before we go any further, just to summarize exactly what happened, because it seemed last week like the Netflix purchase was a done deal, and then Paramount came in. So what exactly happened to block that purchase?
I mean, I've been busy with the Expos, and I have my daily job, and I still play, I'm Uber dad and chef dad. So I haven't read it the way I would usually break it down. But whenever you do a deal, first of all, M&A is 3 steps: interest, intent, and action. So this was obviously way past action. You still have to pass, whether it's regulatory, like, hey, is this a monopoly, right? The government, the FTC has the right to review it. And with a mercurial president in Donald Trump, that's the wild card. And there's a lot in the back where, we could discuss. But there's also sometimes just like, if you have investors from China or Saudi Arabia, the government could say, okay, it's not so much about a monopoly issue. It's just, do we want the Saudis or the Chinese to own an asset? And then there are breakup fees, which run in the billions when you talk about transaction this size. So it could be that Warner Brothers goes, okay, we're going to take the deal from Netflix because we prefer it for reasons 1, 2, 3. But then if any reason Netflix doesn't deliver, or more likely the government blocks it, and that happened with, I think, Microsoft, and was it Activision? There was a deal that first got blocked and then it came back. But there's been deals where things have been made. Yeah. So it's more that then Paramount emerged again saying, wait a minute. And I mean, David Ellison's a very shrewd guy. You could argue that if it wasn't for his dad, he would not have had the platform, but who cares? He's doing something with that platform. But David Ellison, I saw one thing that he said. He's like, well, the deal we already gave to Warner Brothers Discovery shareholders was a better deal. So he's like, the board actually failed on its fiduciary duty to shareholders, but they cannot exactly accept this initial deal we did because they'd be admitting that. So, okay, if we have to sweeten it a bit for them to save face, I mean, that's a hell of a, coup de grace there. So it may not happen because a combination of, oh, wait, was the Paramount Skydance deal better? And if Donald Trump goes, yeah, I don't want this deal where Netflix just buys the business units that they want, you have to take CNN and the cable channels that, again, they're even facing a more downward secular fundamental headwinds. Yeah. So it's not final, but if I had not seen yesterday the conviction with which Ellison's son was speaking, and knowing that his dad is a very competitive guy en plus, then I would have said, no, it'll probably be done. It's just, when you lose something and you're trying somehow to, but it's not done until it's done. In nothing. I mean, in business, sports, you think you're winning, you gave up 2 goals in 40 seconds, and now you're crying, like in your fetal position.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I will also say that this happens a lot if you buy some boring industrial plant in Nebraska, is somebody else could come and be like, wait a minute, we believe that, we agreed to something. You saw it in hockey years ago when Quebec Nordique's Marcel Aubu effectively traded Eric Lindros, the first pick, I think, in 92, to first the Flyers. And then the Rangers gave him a better deal. And he said, well, my interpretation was the deal was not really done with the Flyers, because then he wanted to do the Rangers deal. And then the Flyers were like, pick up line 1. Our lawyers are going to want to have a chat with you, right? So it's not like du jamais vu. Like, this happens. It does happen. But these are much more high-profile assets. So it's in the news.
As far as Paramount is concerned, being one of the, big legacy media companies, are they approaching this from a position of power, or is this more of like a move that they need in order to stay afloat?
Well, if I'm going to be candid, I have nothing against Paramount, Viacom. I built WatchMojo inspired by VH1, MTV. I read all these things, so it's not a knock. I think Paramount alone wasn't a power of weakness because they always would produce shows and sell to others. Yes, they had MTV and stuff, but they needed carriage. They weren't as strong as Disney, let alone Time Warner, let alone NBC Universal. That itself, despite one time being the big bad alpha, male in the room, they themselves realize we have to sell to Comcast. We're just not big enough. It's hallucinant. It's crazy, but it's the major leagues. But I think that changed when Skydance, again, propelled by the Oracle empire and the Ellison's drive, when they stepped into the chat, then yeah, I think people were like, I'm not at all comparing myself to anyone. But it's a bit like with the Expos, with a lot of people, like one of the overarching feedback was we just needed somebody who would give this the attention that it deserved. Because again, I understand if you're like somebody who feels an obligation to do this, but it's one of 5 things and they feel it's a legacy and a duty, not just, okay, yes, there is all that, but just make the argument, make it a priority. It takes somebody, in anything, in history. There's always somebody, not comparing myself to Rosa Parks, but like history's always written because somebody does something that others don't do. So I think with Ellison being this maniacal and ambitious, I haven't read the legalese, but if they have really, really strong arguments and the shareholders of Warner Brothers did indeed take a lesser deal, they have to explain why they took the lesser deal. Now, there could be a reason. There's definitely, they could just explain it and shareholders are like, we're good. But no, I think right now you have two, it's impossible to predict. Like the likely thing is Netflix just seals the deal because Netflix also, yeah, they're a bit more like, they're less conservative than traditional Hollywood, but they would not have been like, oh, fait accompli, here, we got it, send out an email to their users. But I think anything can happen, and it's riveting when you're a fan of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned Netflix's reasons for wanting to acquire those IP from Warner Bros. To just like bolster the depth of their content offering. What would Warner Bros. Reason be for wanting to sell to a company like Netflix?
So again, I think Warner Brothers, the issue is like not structural, but it could be like financial, that it's just going back to the AOL deal. That destroyed so much shareholder value. And when you look at like finance, it's like assets, liabilities, shareholders' equity, like it's all checks and balances. So in that process, they emerged at the end of that with a ton of debt. And even though they were always like the facade looked strong, like in 2010, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Time Warner, was like, I'm not worried about Netflix. They're like the Albanian army. And then a decade later, Netflix was worth $500 billion and Time Warner had to effectively merge, but they kind of gave up and sold to Discovery, which again, a lot of credit to Mr. Zaslav, but I mean, Discovery did not have the jewels and the IP kind of head-to-head, tail of the tape. So I think ultimately Warner needed an exit. They needed some kind of end game of this chapter where they could both clean up their, not income statement, but like we'll just say their balance sheet, the capital structure in terms of debt. And then in the face of declining revenues or revenues not growing as fast as shareholders like, you got to give your shareholders hope and an outcome. So I think it was more like financial engineering, because now all of that IP will basically live on Netflix if Netflix does the deal. Why would Netflix take Batman? Now, this may definitely push Netflix to embrace theatrical more. If there's like a reboot of Batman or something from that amazing treasure trove of IP, yeah, I don't think they would just go straight to consumers. My guess is they're like, years ago, I even said, I've written an article about this for sure, but I was like, Amazon, Microsoft could actually buy the AMCs, like asset purchase, maybe not take any liabilities, but be like, we'll take the good stuff of your business and have like tech experiences where there's movies playing, but it's also where you play with like the latest gear. Almost imagine an Apple store on steroids, but then after you buy your iPhone, you go and sit and watch a movie. And that's also a thing. I do not believe that you could kind of view the tech platforms, in this case, I'll include Netflix, as a homogeneous group. Apple could care less about the storytelling. And no, I mean, that's rude. I'm sorry. I mean, Apple doesn't view it so much as like strategic as tactical. Whereas like Netflix obviously views stories as more than strategy. It's their core. It's their heart, soul, body, mind, everything, right? So these companies react differently. Facebook, Meta now, but Facebook, when they launched Watch, they could care less about videos. It was just like, well, YouTube, we got to attack YouTube if Google's launching Google Plus to come after us. So that was more just like brinkmanship. But any company that's in tech that has ungodly sums of money on their balance sheet, has huge user base. Well, yeah, if you're creating all this content, you just suck up watch time. Watch time means commerce, content, advertising, community, and it's checkmate.
How do you compare this deal to when Disney would acquire, like, let's say Marvel or Fox or Lucasfilm and those types of moves?
Yeah, well, let's set Fox aside because Fox came a decade later, and you could argue if Rupert Murdoch was not at his age, his stage in career, the dynamics in his family, succession vibes. I think let's put that aside. When Disney bought Marvel, LucasArts, and Pixar, it's as if like you have a house and you buy like a couch, a TV to complete a room, right? When Skydance buys a Paramount or Netflix buys, you're not even buying a house, you're buying a whole neighborhood. You're buying a portfolio of IP and universes. So it's not just Batman and DC, which again is in of itself a neighborhood. You also get the DC Looney Tunes and whatever, So you're getting so much more that you can now start to crank out. And remember we said WatchMojo, lucky, but also foresight, we got ahead of the peak TV era, streaming wars. Today, I love what the gentleman said. Why do you cover it? I love serving that fandom, like more movie content. But there's other emerging things that are really strong. I think one is just like knowledge and curiosity around the stuff we cover on this show, like the context, even the unveiled with space travel becoming more relevant. Well, yeah, if people start to go to Mars at first to sell data centers, but eventually space travel and eventually people live there, like that's a vertical we should develop. But and sports is a big one because sports is like recession proof. And, apart from a pandemic, it's a good place to be. I'm always blown away by how much consumers spend at sporting events, but it's an experience. I'm all about experiences, travel, food. I don't drive a fancy car or anything. So I think it's just a different time, but they're not really the same. You could argue that it's more similar to the Fox deal. Yeah, but the reason is different. Fox was a person that said, I'm at an age I need to, his time horizon was very different. Warner Discovery was structural. Like financially, that was going to cause it more than indigestion. So they had to do a deal, and few people could write that check. And Ellison's in this mind, and Netflix. I think Netflix is like well positioned to capitalize from AI, but they're also very much exposed to AI. Not saying anything will happen. I own tons of shares in Netflix still, but I own a lot more in the Googles and those companies, right? Because that's the future.
Coming at this from a consumer perspective, and I think this maybe speaks a little bit to the conversation we had in our meeting earlier this week, where we asked the team what do they think of this situation, and it wasn't entirely positive. So a symptom of Disney acquiring Marvel and all those other companies was kind of like an oversaturation. We got like too many Marvel movies and too much Star Wars stuff, and there was like a fatigue.
Let me ask you something. At first, were you not as a fan happy that Disney invested time, energy, sweat, blood, tears to develop all these universes?
It was great. Yeah. Okay, so at the beginning, it was terrific.
So there, capitalism is wonderful, right? Like there, you're like, somebody took the risk. Like I'm producing shows and series, the time, the energy, the money, just to get it done. Forget then marketing. As an investor I know, he convinced TPG to give him $500 million, and then he bet on fandom, the space we're in. When I was like early on sharing ideas with them, I was like, very confidently explained our thesis. Then I was like, is it crazy? He's like, Ash, he's like, this is the only industry where somebody spends $200 million to build the product, but then spends $200 million to market it. And then they do it over and over again. He's like, you're in a good space. So my point is, yes, because in the end, there's always a regression to the mean. Greed. I mean, not saying they're greedy, but you overdo it. So yes, I do concur that in the second half, everybody overdid it because of shareholders, because of just yourself, you're driven. But, the reality is Lucas, I agree. At some point I was like, just enough. I'm like, this is not necessary. But at first you're like, this is pretty cool. They're bringing these old things that so it comes with the territory. So
my question is, do you think that...
And by the way, why sports franchises are so coveted? Because supply is limited, capped, controlled, demand infinite.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think that Netflix has learned from that? Because I have no idea what they're going to do, but they would have Batman, like all the DC superheroes, Harry Potter, like you mentioned, all of the animated stuff, and even things like Game of Thrones and all these things. Is there any risk of a similar thing happening where like it's too much of a good thing?
So the risk exists all the time. I think Reed Hastings and Ted Sarandos are maybe a bit more, like they're more risk takers, ironically, but I think they're more conservative with milking that cow. I think they're going to be more, wait a minute, let's go bring in the consultants or just ask ChatGPT. What happened when Disney bought this thing? What are the pitfalls? I don't think they would go parabolic the way Disney did. And Disney, to be fair, had bought 3 major portfolio of IP, and then they really went deeper on all 3. So it just also felt like a lot. Like we got hung over Star Wars. We felt food sickness over, Marvel, so it made it seem a lot more jarring. My guess is that Netflix's brass will be a bit more thoughtful, knowing that nobody questioned whether Disney could execute Marvel or Pixar or Lucas, because it's Disney. But I think a lot of people are going to question, and I think this is the main takeaway. I think the bottom line is because Netflix will face a lot more skepticism and cynicism, my guess is Netflix will be a lot more prudent, because also it doesn't really change their business. They're already flying. They got all this, tremendous P&L profile, whereas I do think maybe relative a Paramount Skydance to justify the purchase price will have to be more aggressive with how do we milk the IP. And that's just common sense. If you pay more, you got to monetize more. If you are paying low, you have a safety net, to quote Warren Buffett.
How does a transaction like this affect the mid-tier studios? Is this kind of like the accelerating the demise of the movie studio in a way?
I mean, look, there's disruption on so many levels. You could argue that the mid-tier guys with AI are going to become more powerful and efficient. I get a lot more done with AI because the ideas are in my head, but sometimes you have writer's block, you're tired. Right. So I see how that could be amplified across a gazillion of touch points and steps in the supply chain and all that. But yeah, I do think, though, that small is hard. One of the reasons why I love being independent, we're profitable, debt-free, cash in the bank. There's no reason to sell other than, okay, you bring on an investor after 5, 6, 7 years. You understand if you're not a novice that they're going to want to get out. And now people are interested in YouTube. Long way of saying, I myself, despite all of our confidence and swagger and bluster and whatever, and, mission and all that, it is hard to be a small thing, because you have pressure from the UGC social, any guy with a camera a week later becomes, in 10 days, when people email me, they're like, wow, really exciting what you're doing with the Expos. Again, if I had to summarize it, they're like, you've done more in 10 days than people have done in the, 30, 20 years since they left. And I'm like, it was obvious. I'm not special. It's just the problem here is a finance modeling problem. That's my expertise. I always said, well, why did I do a finance degree if I don't work? Why did I work on all these models and I'm not even an analyst, like Kramer? I don't even work here. I get it now. I understand now. I'm not religious, but I'm like, the people that are like, you were sent to bring back the Expos, I don't think they're crazy. They believe in religion. I understand from their perspective. They're like, this is a miracle. But to me, I'm like, so all I'm getting at is like, being small is great, but if you have pressure from shareholders to grow, as these masters of the universe do, you need scale, and a quick way to scale is to buy. Because things that are sustainable don't scale overnight, and things that are scalable overnight are generally not sustainable. So if you go to either of these brilliant people and you say you get all of DC now, Looney Tunes, I'm like, I would froth at the mouth. I would be salivating if I could, have that to play with instead of starting from scratch. So it makes sense. But yeah, I think if you're small, mid-size, any given Sunday, those inches become harder to get because you're just drowning from the bottom with social and from the top with these huge IP. One thing that's worked well for us in the last couple of years is the maelstrom and hurricane and confusion in traditional, where they're not going all in, trying to cut back, right size, shrink. So it gives us a chance to do more, produce more long form, more different kinds of programming to fill whatever void is left by others that would have done the same thing.
Something that just occurred to me, and I've often thought about, is why is it so difficult now to develop new IP that becomes popular and widely embraced by everybody? Because there's always this focus on like bringing back the old stuff, like repackaging, remaking, sequels. Why is that?
Two reasons. I think one is consumer behavior. I think the mobile phone being more powerful than the first spaceships just gives you so much entertainment that anybody's producing, anybody gets your attention, whereas before people would have less choices. There's just so much. So to create something from scratch, you're not just competing with like the other movie that's coming out that Saturday or Friday or whenever, Tuesday, like music used to be released, or it's just you're competing with the universe. So one is there's just more clutter. Two, and this is why I'm very glad that of all my decisions with WatchMojo, just building on YouTube, in hindsight, I'm like, thank God. It's like, yeah, I like the nice restaurant in the West Village, but if you tell somebody you have a restaurant in Times Square, they're like, wow, who did you have to kibosh for that? I'm like, nothing. I just got there really early. Nobody else cared about Times Square. The other one, I think, is the death of like linear programming, where it's like, again, the example you've heard me. If you have Friends, if you have Seinfeld at 8, Friends at 9, whatever you put at 8:30 will have a shot. Not saying it'll be a success. And that's dead. You can't control. Like, we see it now even with premieres. And I mean, it's not gimmicks. They do well because we time it well and we put thought in it. But that doesn't really that doesn't have the same impact as before when you just slotted something at 9 and people tuned in. Kind of like even like the Tonight Show and the Letterman era, where people would watch their primetime programming, and then they would maybe watch the local news, and then it would just lead into Jay Leno, or before my era, Johnny Carson and Fallon. Now, I mean, that's why even now, if you're Fallon, you're programming for the web. You're actually, if you look at how they do it, they're like, would this be a segment on YouTube? And then they work backwards.
Yeah,
so those are the
I'm reading a take from our producer Ivan, who just wrote this in. He said that it's an overabundance of public opinion. I guess with the internet, everybody's voice is strongly amplified, and trends can emerge so quickly that studios would rather play it safe with proven IPs rather than take a chance on something that people may not like. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's just demand and supply. There's just a ton more stuff, and people have the freedom to watch whatever stuff they want whenever.
So this may not become a monopoly per se, but is it too much concentration of power in one set of hands, so to speak, with Netflix acquiring this catalog potentially?
I mean, I remember when I was building WatchMojo and I talk about copyright risk and platform risk, I remember looking into monopoly, not to like scare YouTube, more just to be like, is YouTube going to mess up? Like, is YouTube going to become stronger in video than Google was in search? And the answer was yes for a while, Your Honor. But my point is, monopoly is like a tricky word, especially in the context of antitrust in America. It's so let's use monopoly very figuratively, because I don't want to be sensationalist. I don't think so, for all the reasons we said. Like, I think most media companies, if they had too much stuff, like too many assets, too many IP, it was more likely that that stuff would get overlooked. you don't want to blame a Disney for over-investing in Marvel. Like, yes, as fans, we can say, you guys ruined this. That's the fan. That's like if I tell the owner of my favorite sports team that he's a bum because you traded a player. Like, that's the fan speaking. You want passion from there. I think what this does is it does just make these companies stronger to compete against the Amazons and the Googles and even the emergence of Roblox. Again, disclosure, ton of shares in Roblox because I think Roblox is the next YouTube. I don't know Roblox the way that if you're an exec at ESPN, you maybe didn't understand YouTube until you had to understand it because your boss was like, why are we not on YouTube? But I think you want all these companies to just have, it's not so much even like size. And this is not like a subliminal, it's the person. You want leadership. You want people that believe in their assets, their people, their IP, whatever, and then invest in it. So if the companies get acquired by people that are going to invest, sure, there may be some layoffs because of redundancies that you don't control. But I think that's like kind of the glib, lazy, anti-capitalist take that doesn't make sense. It's more like, who is it? Judge it on the merits. If it's really going to be somebody in a team that's going to invest and develop and then ergo create jobs down the road, that's healthy. But if it's somebody that's just buying as a financial arbitrage and engineering play and just cut things off to flip it to the greater fool in 2 years, that usually doesn't end well.
I want to talk a little bit more about the Ellisons entering the game and how this kind of like tech class entering the entertainment sphere might affect things. Do you think that it could provide some sort of like creative renaissance, or is it more of like a purely financial decision that may not be in the consumer's best interest, let's say?
So it's fascinating that you framed it both as like Ellison, so father son, because that's one dynamic. But the other one, you're right, that it's tech. It's a tech DNA. Look, I think absolutely technology is just like a wanton blind thing to throw. That's not necessarily the solution. But having a more data-driven, a more analytical brain that then you marry to the creative brain, I think that is the way I said man and machine, man and AI, human and AI is going to be the optimal thing. It just depends on the weight for the task. I do think that is a good thing because like Hollywood, and not just because personally the table was never extended and the doors of the gates were never opened. I'm saying this objectively. Hollywood was just such an inefficient place, kind of like the escalators in malls that force you to go around. Like it was a feature, not a bug. So I do think though that in this era, projects that get stalled in development hell don't help consumers, and they actually waste shareholder value because you're squandering resources. So I think the tech thing is A+. 2, what I don't like is when you have a son and father or daughter mother combo that is coming at it way too much driven by pride, hubris, ego, greed. That I think, and I've studied leaders, that's what I've done for 20 years. I've studied leaders. I've written books about these things. I think you could smell that a mile away. And it's in the public. In my third book, I talked about how WatchMojo early on, when I struggled to be able to raise financing, despite being a business person that understood finance, people just didn't like content. I would often be sometimes introduced to a born on third base, in the words of Barry Switzer, individual. And I didn't care about that. I was just like, is this person competent? Are they honest? Are they capable? If they were, I just looked at it as it's a positive because they are at least ambitious and they're not just living on a yacht 365 days a year doing questionable things. So in this case, I don't doubt that people could point to flaws in David Ellison. I don't know him, but from what I read, what I hear when he speaks, I'm not going to criticize his ambition and drive because people would say that about me. If I just look at the thesis and the approach, I commend him. He's trying to build something. He could have gone and been the heir apparent of Oracle. And I'm sure all those Oracle execs they're the happiest people because they're like, yeah, we don't want the son of the founder. If I could be objective, these professional execs spent all their life building Mr. Ellison's fortune. All of a sudden, Junior comes. That I've seen that as well. But I think in this case, it's just an ambitious person that loves stories, and he wants to channel the energy, in this case known as money, but instead of as a tool for bad and vanity, there's vanity in what he's doing. There's vanity in what people do.
Yeah.
You know, like
Again,
just with the Expos, somebody was like, "Oh, is this a PR?" But that same guy was like, "You came out of left field." I'm like, "Well, wasn't that proof that I'm not in it for PR? Because for 20 years, I purposely built WatchMojo and not AshMojo. This is just, I hear MLB when I read, they're like, we need a person. So I need to show them I'm a credible person. I'm not here saying murder Pete Carroll." And that's just a friendly shot at our friend Dave there, you know. But like,
Pete Carroll,
I've always said, like,
he's old enough. Leave him alone.
But all to say, I think in this case, it's a good injection of vision ultimately and conviction. So I personally view it as good. But I understand how most people view it as like, oh, it's just a rich kid who's playing with dad's money.
So all that to say, you don't see nepotism being a problem in this scenario.
No, I don't like nepotism when it's like, when it gives the wrong person. Like if nepotism leads to, I believe it's a kekistocracy or whatever, it's like the worst people get the worst positions to do the worst things. That's not good. But like, if you have to understand, like I mean, I'm grateful for my parents. They brought us to Canada. They paid for my education. I'm good. They didn't need to do anything more. But I had to do this myself, so to speak. And I had a great team. If my daughters in 5 years were like, I like working in media, or you invested in this startup, I don't want to punish them either for their dad having some, like a Rolodex or the means. I wouldn't force it upon them. And if they came and they were not the right person for that initial job or internship, I would talk to them candidly, amicably, respectfully, and match them to the position that I'd have with all of you. If I could, if the one thing I will like be a bit more brash is, I took a lot of people that frankly could have failed in the wrong position, and I found out where to put them. Using a baseball analogy, I was a great, outfielder, decent arm, but I never pretended to be the pitcher that could throw 100 pitches, 100 miles an hour. My arm would be on the floor, right? So when you position people in the right place, so if David Ellison was a bum, I wouldn't feel this way, right? So I don't like nepotism. Nepotism is also why I ended up becoming an entrepreneur, because I saw how things are done in the real world. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying nepotism is like capitalism, a cop-out. It's a detail. It's not the thing, like sometimes you want somebody who knows the business, knows the legacy to be there. Like with the Expos, there's a lot of institutional knowledge that like the Bronfmans have. That is priceless, invaluable, right? But as I said, it's not nepotism. It's the detail. It's enough to be an investor to be like, well, they are a third generation family office. Society, Montreal, the community can go to them and expect them to take the risks that a private equity would and have vetoes and rights that are going to make sense. I can already see where the puck goes, that conversation would fall apart, right? Mm-hmm. So the issue is not nepotism or capitalism, but really case by case in this situation, what yields an optimal outcome? If David Ellison was a playboy, and people change. Jay Penske, whose father was the Penske team racing, he had like a moving company. Penske's father was actually a race car driver himself, and he realized, I might get killed. I'm more valuable long-term being a business person. So it's fascinating how people think. But Jay Penske, when he was younger, he did some stupid things. I think he like urinated outside of a bar in Connecticut. And I'm not saying this to I'm defending him. I've never done that, by the way. But my point is, if you're Penske, somebody's going to see it and they'll run with the story. Whereas if Ashkan Karbas-Fushan does it when he's 16, nobody cares. They're like, oh, that must be homeless. So it's like, but now he's one of the best operators in media. So do I care that his dad? No, at this point, I judge him for his track record, which is ultimately what capitalism is all about. You should judge people for their results. And yes, if somebody goes out and does something profane and bad or bad conduct, just banish them for a while, forever if you want. It's up to you. It's your morals or whatever. But I'm just saying that, like, and why I do these shows, the whole capitalism is good or capitalism is bad, nepotism, it's a detail. What are you doing? Are you creating value? Are you creating jobs? Are you helping people? If you are, the rest is just jealousy and envy and noise.
Let's look ahead a little bit now. we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but just generally speaking, the
I
future
know.
of streaming, the futuring of media. Well, no, I know you got your theories, which are
Well, yeah, no, I agree. I don't know. And anybody that pretends to know, that's why I hate the futurist tag there. I think you're just going to see an acceleration of. I'll give you a perfect example. You're going to see an acceleration of all these things at a pace that is going to be so frenetic that people are just going to have whiplash. When I started to look at the expos, like for my soon to come, the Academy School of Entrepreneurship, and I mean it earnestly. I'm like, I used to write about this stuff. Now I could just mobilize and make it happen. I was like the old playbook, and I've never played by the old playbook, is to go hand in hand, Mr. Bell Media, Mrs. Or Mr. Quebecor, Mr. Bell Media, whatever. Please partner with me. We need you for the rights. And I would love to partner with them if I could pull this off, or even just be in a position to make my case. But if we're talking about an expansion team in, say, 2030, why would I not go to Google, who owns YouTube, our biggest platform, and say, you have YouTube TV, you have YouTube, the AVOD that's free. We're building Mojo TV, our fast. People spend 40 minutes each session to watch our videos. By 2030, I'm just exploring this. MLB is not giving me a mandate. They don't even know who I am. Or I emailed them twice, but I've left them alone since, once I realized, there's just a process to follow. Why wouldn't I go to Google and say, do you want the global rights to these games? Global, obviously. Like, by then the world's in a different place. So yes, the world is changing. And I think you're going to see far crazier things. Because even at the beginning of this year, if you would have polled the 100 smartest media executives, futurists, analysts, investors, and said, by year's end, is Netflix going to buy Paramount? I think 2 people would have said maybe, 0 would have said yes, 98 would have said, what are you smoking? Give me some.
It seems to have come out of left field.
But when you saw what was happening and YouTube became this dominant thing with TV being their main platform, I knew that Netflix was like, man, we were early. We beat the traditional guys in Hollywood, but YouTube could kill us because the definition, they're revolutionary. The definition of programming has changed. And it's not just the dog on a skateboard or the cat falling off a tree. When we produce, the humanities videos, let's say, like true crime or the things in business, or even the longer form documentaries that are pop culture, that kind of is engaging that. If you're old media, you're like, maybe we should go where the audience is, which is YouTube.
Yeah. So, okay, crazy question now. YouTube, we know, is not in the business of production, but should they change their mind, could they kill Netflix?
So I don't think anybody's going to kill Netflix or Google like YouTube, just because relative to, like, they do have moats. Like, YouTube is the most defensive business in the history, and people used to say Google, but YouTube is more because they got this content, right? Whereas ChatGPT scared Google into implementing AI. So props to Sundar Pichai, but you could criticize him for being just the employee executive and not a founder visionary. But he had the conviction, the courage, the confidence to do something that most people, innovators' dilemma, would not have done. So let's see that. So YouTube is like YouTube is the best business. Like, if I had all my money in the world, I could go into one company. I would even carve out YouTube out of Google and give it to YouTube. So YouTube, I'm not afraid. Netflix, I think, does face more existential threats, partly because they never really had IP that, no disrespect to Squid Games and Stranger Things, but Netflix, if something else comes or whatever, people eventually are just on goggles, and then, that consumption, like the nicotine tobacco, like if people care about the nicotine, but then the cigarette was the delivery mechanism and that changes, they'll get their nicotine elsewhere, which is why vapes are popular if you think about it. So I think those companies are pretty good in terms of positioning. I think YouTube is, and it's hard for analysts who are not in it, but I think YouTube is disproportionately stronger than Netflix. Again, I own shares in both, but I own a lot more shares in Google as a result. And my conviction of Google is more YouTube and other than search. I think search is fine, but search is like you invested in Verizon at some point. It's more of an annuity than a growth play. I think Netflix addressed a lot of it by doing this. So they're both going to be very strong, and they're both going to get stronger. But I also think that we are on the cusp of more change that we cannot even understand because of AI, but also because if you think about it, the human body was not actually set up to live like this, you know? So there is an enterprising person, could be Mark Zuckerberg, sorry, with the Ray-Bans, could be Evan Spiegel. I also have shares in Snap, which I've held on to. They went super up. I didn't sell. I didn't need the money. They came back down. I've kept them. Because if he could figure out some kind of headset, just glasses at the end of the day, that don't make you look like, to quote what people said, a glass hole, I think that is going to be super disruptive. But then I also think that what we view as entertainment will change. Then it will no longer be like, hey, I had a long day, I'm going to watch sports or a movie. Then I do think the way social media and shorts have changed the definition and game of mindshare, then I think how we entertain ourselves and inform ourselves and consume things and experiences will change to the point where, yeah, maybe it is a more immersive travel. Maybe that becomes a bigger category where people are just like traveling to places and it feels real. When I was at Disney, I was like, I got on this thing and I was like, my God, put this on a headset and people are going to be, in this thing all day.
Just as a final point, seeing where things are going, good or bad for consumers?
I honestly, I think in aggregate, actually very good. But I think if you are the unlucky one and they go, hey, we're going to develop these 4 Looney Tunes characters, sorry, the fat pig must die. Like, if you love that one character, or if you were hoping that DC was going to roll out that 18th version of some obscure, no, there's going to be a flight to quality. So within those acquisitions, they're going to double down on the good stuff. So some consumers might feel like this sucked, but no, I think this is tremendously good in either scenario. In either scenario, it's good because it's fresh energy is what you need. You need fresh blood. I see that. I used to play soccer, and I had stamina. I would always like kill myself till the last play. But sometimes I was like, should I get off if somebody has fresh legs? And I would look at the guys. I'm like, yeah, that's fine. I'm kidding. But that's the thing. So what you're seeing is Netflix will bring fresh energy to Warner Brother Discovery. And if somehow Ellison can pull it off in extra innings, he will bring a ton of energy. And I do think some of it, but we don't even need to go, I think some of that is more the drama in the background. Like, is there too much money coming from the Gulf? Does Donald Trump really hate CNN, so he's going to put something that makes one more likely than the other to buy? I think that is actually the only intangible at this point, aside from what's in the legal documents. But it's fascinating,
Yeah, we didn't even touch on the kind of like a global money that filters in.
You know what? What we should do is, as I continue to research this packaging exercise with MLB that I would like to one day present to them if they do have an expansion process. I always knew this stuff, but I now am formalizing my knowledge, updating my knowledge regarding high net worth individuals, family offices, sovereign funds. So we could do that like using the expos, but not talking about the expos, talking more about what's happening in Hollywood. Because it's funny, I knew a lot of people that were involved in this deal. And even when people are under confidentiality, they'll say stuff and you're like, okay, I think I know. So like everybody went to Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. Like everybody just went straight there. So I had 2 different people that were like trying to go get this asset and they were all going to the same source of funds. So that means the power dynamics have changed. Whereas before you would just go on Wall Street and issue debt or raise financing. You do that, but I think the sovereign funds and the Gulf money will accelerate because they want to diversify from oil. If you're bin Salman, you look at Dubai, you're like, they built a travel hub. So I think for them, they're like, entertainment could be the way to go.
Kind of a weird pivot, but very interesting, and we can get into that.
Well, I mean, you know what it is? It's the person. Mohammed bin Salman, like David Ellison, is a fan of gaming, and he's a fan of these franchises, right? So it's like, I like the stuff that WatchMojo covered. It's not a coincidence. You got to have passion for what you do. If I wasn't passionate about the Expos, I mean, if I wasn't a big hard sports fan, I would still help, but I would know that that's not ultimately my thing. because I'm like, if you don't really have the passion and the patience and the persistence for the thing that you're operating, running, you'll check out. But you know, so I think it's net positive because of that reason. You want people to, and I'm not talking my book, it's a fundamentally philosophy. You want people that care, that pay attention. People have said this: what you pay attention to grows.
Yep.
But if it's an afterthought, it's an afterthought, and people can tell.
Well, we'll leave it there for now. Interesting times, and I'm sure it won't be the last time we discuss this. So stay tuned for future discussions on this topic. But it's always great, Ash. Thank you for your time today. See you all next week. Take it easy, everybody.
Bye, guys.